and we're happy to see you here. So I am Sharmila Parmanand. I'll be chairing our session this afternoon. I am a research fellow at the Department of Gender Studies at LSE. So just to remind everyone, this session is being recorded, and we've set aside about 20 to 30 minutes at the end for questions. You will have the opportunity to ask your questions personally. Just use the raise hand function and I'll call on you. But for those who would rather not speak or who can't, you can also paste your questions in the chat or send them to me privately, and I'll read them out for you. So our guest today is Gowri Vijayakumar. She is an assistant professor of sociology and women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Brandeis. Her research and teaching use feminist and transnational perspectives to understand the trajectories of social movements, the everyday life of the state, and the political economy of globalization. So today she will be talking about her new book titled At Risk: Indian Sexual Politics and the Global AIDS Crisis. It's published by Stanford University Press. I don't want to preempt Gowri too much, but having read this book over the weekend and really enjoyed it, I'm going to say that it presents a really fascinating and engaged ethnographic account of the response to the AIDS crisis on multiple scales. So the global governance architecture composed of key institutions, experts, and funding flows, and how these interacted with the state and its multiple competing bases of authority, and more importantly, how it opened up new political possibilities for marginalized and at-risk groups, and the ways in which these individuals and groups were transformed in the process. So I found that such a great read, and I'm really excited to hear from Gowri now. So Gowri, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be able to bring some Boston sunshine to you all in London. And I couldn't have asked for a nicer introduction. Thank you so much for reading and engaging with my book. I know that your work, Sharmila, also deals with sex work and anti-trafficking discourses. So I know there's some convergences in the questions we're interested in. So as Sharmila mentioned, I'm going to be presenting from the book today, and it came out earlier this year, so it's relatively new. And I just wanted to kind of mention before I start that, presenting from a book is always a difficult endeavor because there's so much ground to cover. There's so many kind of intersecting arguments to pay attention to. And so what I'm going to try to do is give you a kind of broad impression of the book and then focus on kind of field work from a couple of parts of the book, kind of 2 chapters of the book. And then I'm happy to talk more in our discussion about any details you find intriguing or any parts of the story that kind of feel like they're areas of more interest for you. And this is kind of also my disclaimer in a way to say that whatever feels underdeveloped here is hopefully more developed in the book. So I'm going to just share my screen. Is that working for everybody? Okay, great. So the global AIDS response is one of the largest global governance projects in history. Funding for HIV/AIDS programs increased from $4.9 billion in 2001 to $23.3 billion in 2017, and was $21.5 billion in 2020. In today's pandemic world, it's not hard to imagine how a pandemic can upend every aspect of existence, right? This is what we're all living. We know how a public health crisis can reconfigure politics. We know how it can change our aspirations and our fears and create new ways for us to care for one another. But when I started my project in the early 2010s, I was often told that AIDS was no longer worth studying. It was not a hot topic anymore. People said there was almost too much written about it, and mentors and advisors told me it was kind of an issue of the past. People were more confused when I told them I wanted to study India and the AIDS epidemic. Typically, in the American popular imagination, AIDS is something that once long ago happened to white gay men in the United States, and now it only happens to people in Africa. This imaginary, as the editors of the recent volume, AIDS and the Distribution of Crisis, point out, allows the erasure of an ongoing HIV epidemic among Black, Latinx, Asian, and Native and other minoritized groups in the United States and Europe, and maps onto imaginations of Africa as a place of poverty and disease. This is a map from UNAIDS of new HIV infections in 2020. And you can see here, many countries are grayed out because data is not available or reported, but you can see how this image kind of reinforces the idea of where AIDS is a problem and where it's not. Within this imagined geography, India is not imagined as the site of an AIDS catastrophe. But in the early 1990s, experts were actually sure that it would become an AIDS catastrophe. So these are headlines from the New York Times between 1987 and 1996. And you can see here, and this is kind of a reflection of the North American AIDS consensus and also kind of global institutional consensus. India was kind of a sexually conservative country that was sitting on an epidemiological time bomb. By the mid-1990s, Indian and North American AIDS experts agreed that India faced the biggest AIDS epidemic in the world, with 3 million people HIV positive, and estimates ranging from 5 to 50 million people by the 2000s. These estimates would be drastically revised down later on. So by 2007, the estimate was more like 2.4 million, but these kind of larger estimates in this period created a large amount of panic during this period. So massive global financial resources were infused into the Indian AIDS response from institutions like the World Bank, the Global Fund, DFID, and the Gates Foundation in response to this idea of the Indian AIDS crisis. So just to give you a sense, this is a chart that represents overseas development aid to India from the late 1990s through 2018. So the green line represents commitments to STD control and AIDS, and the gray line is the rest of the health sector. And you can see those spikes kind of in around 1999 and 2007. Those are the beginnings of the national AIDS control programs, the phases of the national AIDS control programs in India. And you can see at those points, there was actually more funding going to HIV and AIDS than the entire rest of the health sector in India. And this is actually a graph that you could see similarly or even more extremely in other countries as well. So the budget for the National AIDS Control Program's third phase, which started in 2007, was $2.5 billion. At the same time, HIV prevalence, or the proportion of the population living with HIV in India, was relatively low. So at its peak in 1998, it touched 0.5%. Today, it's about 0.2% estimated to be. And today, there are about 2.1 million people estimated to be living with HIV, which makes it the third largest epidemic in the world because of India's large population. But in the context of kind of living HIV in India, it's one of many competing forms of violence and illness and exclusion. So just as an example, 120,000 adults in India died of malaria per year in the early 2000s, and 100,000 of AIDS-related causes. So this is roughly the same number of deaths. But in 2006, donors dispersed $19 million for malaria control and $108 million for AIDS, or 5 times the amount. So India's encounter with AIDS offers an intriguing site to study the intersection of global crisis and politics. And I use global crisis in particular to mean kind of something that's defined as a crisis within the global field. So on the one hand, by the early 2000s, India was facing massive amounts of money and political pressure from global governance institutions and donors to respond to what experts said would be a devastating crisis. On the other hand, the everyday lives of most people were not affected by HIV, and there were many other demands on the state's attention. The other key feature of this, of course, and this is central to my project, was that AIDS affected in particular groups who were criminalized and marginalized. So cisgender women in sex work, transgender women, men who have sex with men, including various collective formations such as Koti, Hijra, and Aravani. And so the AIDS response in India meant some unusual encounters. Here we see Bill Gates talking with a group of sex workers in Bangalore, where I did my fieldwork. And I'll also say, if I'm showing photos with people in them, they're all publicly available because I didn't take pictures mostly of people during my fieldwork. But I never saw Bill Gates in person, but I did go to this office and meet some of the other people in this picture. So one of the driving interests of my book is this intersection of unexpected alliances. At the same time that they were criminalized and subject to everyday state violence by one arm of the state, sex workers were conscripted into a mass public health effort by another. HIV prevention programs presented spaces in which those deviant forms of sexuality and gender that posed a risk to the nation were reformulated as central to the nation's success in the global AIDS field. So my basic research question emerges from this contradiction. I ask, how did the AIDS crisis reconfigure Indian sexual politics? In particular, what did it mean for India's place in the world, or what I'm thinking of as the global AIDS field? What did it mean for how the state engaged with sexually marginalized people? And what did it mean for the everyday lives of people who were designated at risk? So what my book argues, and this is an attempt to boil down a lot of interrelated arguments, is that AIDS cut to the heart of tensions about the kind of nation state India was and could be. AIDS experts charted a shift from India's poverty and sexual morality in the early stages of the epidemic to modernity and tolerance as an emerging world power by the time I was doing my fieldwork. Secondly, AIDS transformed the terrain on which at-risk groups engaged the state and gave them a conditional opening for making demands. And then finally, AIDS reshaped people's lives, or AIDS institutions reshaped people's lives as they learned new ways of naming, embodying, and practicing sexuality. So ultimately, I show in my book that global institutions' response to crisis and the state's kind of response to that can transform political life in intimate ways, but not always in a top-down way. So this emerges through a process of contestation at multiple scales. So the book engages with multiple literatures. I just kind of wanted to point to key inspirations for me for the purposes of this talk, and I'm happy to talk more about any of this if anyone is interested. So one is the literature on AIDS exceptionalism. So this literature talks about how AIDS has been exceptionally well funded as a special celebrity cause, kind of stands apart from other global issues and draws resources away from other equally important issues because it had become so important kind of in Western imaginary. So scholars like Adia Benton and others have shown how people contest and engage with these kind of logics of exceptionalization. Second, I draw on the literature on global fields, which argues that states compete with each other for material resources and status. So here, states aren't just passive victims of global institutions or the Gates Foundation, and global discourses aren't traveling to the global south in one direction, but states are actively navigating global fields of struggle. Third, I draw on feminist and queer sociologists who map struggles over sexuality on and beyond the terrain of the state. So here, the state can't just impose its will. People fight back and challenge and inhabit state practices, even as the state can produce new ways of being and thinking. And in my book, I really try to kind of think of the state as a multifaceted and contradictory set of institutions that's often kind of dealing with particularly sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people in very contradictory ways. So this is just an overview, as I said, and I'm happy to talk more about this in our discussion, but I just kind of wanted to lay out some of my inspirations theoretically. So this is kind of a map of my main research sites, or the ones where I spent the most time. So Bangalore, Kolkata, and Nairobi. I also did interviews in Delhi and Chennai, visited different community-based groups in Northern Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Mysore. And the heart of the project was really in Bangalore. So that's where most of the basis of this talk lies. And that's kind of where my ethnography is really rooted. Bangalore was a useful site for many reasons, but especially because it's the capital of Karnataka, which was designated as a high prevalence state for HIV in the early days of the epidemic in India. And so the Gates Foundation designated it as a focus state for its large-scale HIV prevention programs. So a lot of the kind of globally circulating research about AIDS in India was actually done in Karnataka and in collaboration with some of the organizations I spent time with in Bangalore. So the bulk of this research was interviews and participant observation, both with government officials and with grassroots members of sex worker organizations, sexual minority organizations, and transgender organizations. I also chose 3 organizations to spend more time with, attending events and in some cases organizing with them or supporting their research efforts. And it's worth mentioning that most of the people I interviewed within HIV prevention programs were not HIV positive. So because of the Indian government's focus on HIV prevention rather than AIDS treatment, the programs I studied largely focused on bringing together these at-risk groups to get tested regularly and distributed condoms, but most of them weren't directly affected by HIV. So they perceived HIV more as kind of a set of institutions than as a disease that was affecting their communities, though it was also affecting their communities at the same time. I just kind of want to note that. And this slide also kind of contains some of my other methods, and I'm happy to talk about this in more detail as well. So I already kind of mentioned and laid out kind of these 3 pieces of my argument. And in this talk, I'm going to mainly focus on the first and the third parts. So I'll start with the first, and then I'll move to the kind of to the third part. So in the early 1980s, there was already a debate about whether AIDS in India was really a crisis at all. The question was tied up with India's place in the world order. What countries could India be compared to? So on one hand, some commentators compared India to African countries. So in 1994, the director of the National AIDS Control Organization, which had just formed at this time, described a really alarming rise in HIV. This was in the Journal of the Indian Medical Association. He wrote, the trends in Bombay, in fact, are quite comparable to the trends earlier observed in some of the African states like Nairobi, Addis Ababa, from mid-80s onwards. The trends are so similar as to forewarn us about the impending epidemic of HIV involving the general population, as has happened in these African countries. So you can kind of see this comparison, this comparing logic at play here. On the other hand, a 1995 editorial in the same journal worried that AIDS might just be a prelude to test the so-called AIDS vaccine on the Asian people. So this author concluded that AIDS was in fact being disseminated from the developed countries who are notorious for their permissive society. So here you see kind of a different comparative logic, not to Africa, but to the West, right? And the tensions of the post-colonial nation state in the face of AIDS. And the danger of being subjugated to a sexually permissive West that threatens the sovereignty of the decolonizing third world, kind of through the testing of vaccines on a poor population. And these are kind of a couple of poles of the discourse at this time within Indian medical journals. Here are just a couple of images from public health campaigns at the time. So these images emphasize the monogamous heterosexual home against the dangers of foreign sex. So what's implied in a lot of these is that the man is going to the city to have sex with a sex worker. So here we have go abroad to earn and come back quickly, but don't go near a woman and don't bring back AIDS. The state public health campaigns from this time I found didn't necessarily address homosexuality kind of directly, but the newspaper articles and medical journal articles I analyzed from this time period were preoccupied with homosexuality. And there was an ongoing debate about whether India's HIV epidemic was even a problem when it was really kind of a Western disease that resulted from Western vices like homosexuality. So here's an example from a newspaper article where an expert is interviewed by the press, and he says, Indian values will ward off AIDS, and he gives the example that the homosexuality percentage in India was 5 to 15% homosexuals compared to 40 to 60% in the US. So a lot of scholars have written about these kind of post-colonial binaries of Western and Indian sexuality, the West being homosexual, India being kind of heterosexual during the early years of the AIDS epidemic, but less has been written about the idea of Africa in these discourses. So I'm trying to kind of think about both of these together when I map these comparative logics. So as Cindy Patton writes, global imaginaries of AIDS can be mapped directly onto pre-existing national and cultural formations, and the idea of Africa is central to those. I'm also inspired here by Antoinette Burton's work on imaginations of Africa and their role in supporting ideas of Indian nationhood and modernity. So over time, the preoccupation with the West diminished, and AIDS experts actually increasingly kind of settled on the idea that India had a heterosexual epidemic instead of a homosexual epidemic. So essentially, they kind of agreed that India was more like Africa than the West. And India and Africa were both kind of heterosexual places, not degenerate homosexual places like the West. So you can see this description of the trajectory of AIDS from gay communities in San Francisco to entire populations in Africa, and then finally to Asia. So as Siddharth Dubey, an AIDS activist, wrote at this time, and this was kind of a common kind of narrative of the trajectory of Indian AIDS, Africa's present HIV/AIDS caused hell is very probably India's future. In the book, I talk about how mechanisms of statistical modeling, citational practice, and transnational research partnerships actually reinforce these forewarnings. This is a term from Manjari Mahajan. So largely North American researchers, specifically Canadian researchers, were traveling across South Africa, Kenya, and India, reinforcing the connection between the countries and insisting that what happened in India, Africa would also happen in India, and particularly Kenya. So Africa became this kind of frightening alternative pathway for India in the context of the threat of AIDS. So this meant that after the first case of AIDS was identified in India in 1986, the state began to crack down in particular on two groups that represented this threat: sex workers and Africans, or in the medical literature, they're referred to more euphemistically as a pool of infected women and foreign students. After an African student was found to be HIV positive, the Indian Ministry of Health announced in 1986 that AIDS testing was compulsory for all foreign students seeking admission to Indian universities. And then by 1987, 11 African students had already been deported. These repressive measures were immediately met with protest. African students protested the racist guidelines by boycotting the test. And in 1987, African students organized a protest march in Delhi, arguing that the testing constituted medical apartheid. And this was kind of one of the earliest kind of AIDS activist moments in India. In Tamil Nadu, medical authorities began detaining sex workers for mandatory testing and confinement. This too was met with protests. So in 1988, activists in Chennai led by Shamla Natraj went to court to challenge the detention of 5 HIV positive sex workers who were among the first to test positive for AIDS in India. In 1990, and this is reported in the article on the right, over 900 women had been brought to Madras from Bombay on a train called the Mukti Express, the Freedom Express. And the press reported it as a symbol of freedom and liberation to be tested for AIDS. And then once they were in Madras, they were kind of placed in this confinement with limited food and access to medical care. They were cut off from their families. There was a woman who died during that confinement. And Nataraj's legal challenge eventually resulted in the release of over 800 women who'd been detained because they were suspected to be HIV positive and they were sex workers. So you can already see kind of AIDS activism emerging in this time. So in the early 1990s, AIDS activism was working across constituencies. So for example, these are two reports by the AIDS Bedbhav Virodi Andolan. The first report published in 1990, Women in AIDS Denial and Blame, included accounts of the detention of Dominic D'Souza in Goa, the death of a sex worker while in confinement in Madras, and doctors' refusal to treat an African diplomat who died of AIDS in Delhi. And then Less Than Gay, the report on the left, was published the following year, and it was an expansive account of gay life in India. So ABVA pushed for the stalling of the AIDS Prevention Bill of 1989, and they filed a writ petition in 1994 to strike down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalized sodomy or homosexuality kind of effectively. And this would actually lay the groundwork for the Naz Foundation's challenge to 377 in 2001, which kind of eventually resulted in the decriminalization of homosexuality in 2018. So this activism became a major challenge to the state's repressive AIDS response. By the mid-1990s, there were several organizations working specifically with cisgender women in sex work who were part of the AIDS response, like DMSC in Kolkata, VAMP in Sangli, SIAP in Chennai, and Samraksha in Bangalore. These are just a few examples of organizations doing this work. So far, I've focused mainly on the early years of the pandemic. And these were years when Indian experts kind of dismissed the dangers of the homosexual West, but fanned the panic about the specter of an African trajectory for AIDS. And then kind of in response, violently repressed groups that represented a threat to Indian national sexual morality. And this spurred a range of activist responses. So to kind of fast forward a bit, by 2012, when I was doing fieldwork, this narrative had radically shifted. So now this idea of India following the path of Africa had been replaced. And the new narrative was of India's success in contrast to Africa's failure. So for example, this is an article from 2015 on World AIDS Day, which notes how India can look back with some success at its programs in contrast to sub-Saharan Africa. And you can also see these kind of this imagery in this article, the vast swaths of densely populated, unhygienic living quarters, crippling poverty and malnutrition, right? That kind of linked India to sub-Saharan Africa in the early years, and then kind of India has moved past them by 2012. So here we can see some of the celebratory news coverage of India's successful AIDS response in this same period. So for the people I interviewed, this success story wasn't just about the kind of successful prevention of a disease. It was about the success of the nation on the world stage. So this is from a high-ranking AIDS official who I interviewed, who's pointing out that the AIDS response had become a point of national pride. From being a traditional country whose sexual values would protect it from AIDS in the 1980s, India had become this kind of crisis waiting to happen in the 1990s and the next Africa. And then finally, by the 2010s, it was a modern nation capable of leading the world with its AIDS response. So these moments emphasize how ultimately the AIDS response had been tied up with these ideas of India's place in the global AIDS field and its modernity as a post-colonial nation state. So far I've kind of shown you this first piece of the argument. So how AIDS cut to the heart of tensions about the kind of nation state India was within a global field in contrast to both Africa and the West. So in the second part of the talk, I'm going to move to the offices of HIV prevention programs to kind of show you how these discourses were contested, embodied, reworked kind of in everyday practice. So how did HIV prevention programs create an environment in which these sexual identities could be imagined differently? So first, some context. So in the 2000s, the Indian state increasingly responded to and incorporated some of the activist challenges I spoke about earlier into the state AIDS response. And this incorporation was in response to a practical reality, right? So preventing the spread of HIV required the state to reach groups that were criminalized and precarious. And this would mean moving outside of the traditional government machinery. So, I interviewed state officials who literally said they didn't know who the sex workers were, or they didn't know how to identify a man who had sex with men. So they needed activists and community-based groups to show them how to do the work that was required to kind of save India from HIV. And this meant that typical sexual moralities had to be suspended, right? So it was in this context that the state and donors ended up working very closely with sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people, and often kind of organizations with ideologies quite at odds with the state, and relying on them to prevent HIV at a national scale. So this is kind of the context for this close imbrication of the state and these marginalized groups. So Raghu was one of the first people I interviewed, and he was someone who had worked his way up from being a beneficiary of HIV prevention programs to eventually a director and a nationally recognized activist. He put this most directly. He said, HIV gave me an identity. So this might sound surprising considering HIV was a disease that was devastating people around the world and within the communities that Raghu was part of. And people were dying of AIDS around him. But this kind of idea that HIV gave him an identity is at the heart of what I want to explore in this section of the talk. And here, you might also think of Chaitanya Lakhim-Shetty's work, which talks about how HIV is a friend to sex workers in India. So I want to focus on kind of three concrete ways that people's lives were reshaped within HIV prevention drop-in centers: naming sexuality, diversified income, and shared space. So first, naming sexuality. Naming sexuality was central to the everyday experience of the HIV prevention workers and activists I interviewed. HIV prevention programs initially used three strict categories for at-risk groups: men who have sex with men, or MSM, female sex workers, or FSWs, and IV drug users, or IDUs. And they funded separate organizations to run HIV prevention for each group. Categories like Koti, Satla Koti, double-decker, Panti, bisexual, and Jogapa were also used to categorize MSMs in the documents that I reviewed that were kind of reports and tracking documents. Female sex workers were less kind of internally differentiated in these documents, but they were, their sites of solicitation were documented carefully. So brothel-based, street-based, home-based were carefully documented. And people within organizations who were HIV prevention workers were very familiar with these categorizations. So regardless of the specific language, knowing the category one belonged to was central to the process of becoming an HIV prevention worker and to everyday practice within HIV offices. So when someone started working in the office or attending it, the first thing they did was go to a counseling session in which they were asked questions about their sexual practice. And many of my interviewees told me that that counseling session was the first time they heard the term they now used most often to describe themselves within HIV prevention spaces or activist spaces, but also now in their everyday lives. So the Sunday meeting of one CBO I often visited always began with a round of introductions. Each person would say their name and their sexuality. And these same introductions would then be used when members attended outside events, trainings, or political rallies. In Ashok Alexander's book about the Gates Foundation's AIDS program in India, he describes a transgender person coming up to Bill Gates and touching his feet and saying TG, so transgender, while he touches his feet. So learning how to describe one's identity was an important part of the experience of HIV prevention. So this is an excerpt from an interview with someone I call Srinivas, who worked at one of these CBOs. And he told me rarely of new members who lacked clarity about who they were. So this account of learning to describe one's identity and wasn't just unique to Srinivas, it was almost universal among those I interviewed. So I'll just read his account. He says, many people don't know, am I a Koti, TG, DD, bisexual? They need to have clarity about what I am. I should know I'm a bisexual. They are confused. So I ask, why is this important? They are confused. Some say I'm a Panti, they'll be DD, but they say they're Panti. They don't know with clarity. They should be able to say it themselves. Then I asked if he was also that way. Says, I was confused. I'd say, why do you call me Koti? After training, I understood. Now I say I'm bisexual. So you can see this kind of journey toward being able to name sexuality in a way that's legible within these programs. A second way HIV programs changed the lives of sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people was in diversifying their income. So here I want to tell you the story of one of my interviewees who I call Preeti. And I talk about her story at length in the book. So Preeti identified as a transgender woman. She had done sex work when she lived in the Hijra community after she'd migrated to Bangalore, but she later left her Hijra family to live separately because she'd found a partner who was paying for her rent. But then the partner and she broke up, and Preeti fell into a deep depression. She was kind of cut off now from family, as well as from the Hijra community. So at this point, she started working as an HIV prevention worker. So she told me how she changed once she started working. So this is a passage from an interview with her. She says, before I used to spend a lot on clothing. I'd buy the cloth in the morning, get it stitched in the afternoon, and wear that outfit and go out that evening. The neck would be this deep and I'd pull the veil up like this. So she showed me how she kind of pull it up really high so that her breasts were visible. Back then, that was my only job. Sex work was my only way of earning. But now I don't make the neck deep. I go and sit at the bar, I start drinking, and the clients come to me on their own. I say I work in an HIV prevention NGO. And if they're interested, they say, come with me, madam. And I have a lodge I usually go to, so I take them there. So you can see here how for Preeti, this kind of diversification of her income meant something more than just needing to do less sex work because she was now also getting paid to do HIV prevention work. It also meant that she wasn't only a sex worker anymore and that now she had an office job. It also meant that Preeti had adopted a new kind of embodiment, right? So in this passage, she describes how she had learned to move through the world differently, how she learned to dress differently and kind of embody a new demure femininity. A final element of how HIV prevention programs helped mobilize new kinds of sexual identities was shared space. The drop-in center was a central part of HIV prevention programs in the experience of those I interviewed. They served a purpose in allowing cisgender women sex workers, working class transgender women, and men who have sex with men to gather privately away from public spaces, and public spaces could often be sites of violence and harassment. So the first time I visited one of these offices, a drop-in center for cisgender women in sex work, it was the privacy that surprised me. So the office sat on a major street, but it was kind of hidden away from public view. So you kind of went up a narrow, dark staircase, and then when you got to the top, there's this bright, airy layout and shiny marble floors. There are posters on the walls, and the office had lots of natural light. And I was told that Bill Gates, the South African Minister of Health, and the director of NACO had all visited this office, and even some movie stars. But none of this was clear from the street, so there wasn't even a sign marking it. So at one of the offices I visited most regularly, the first thing you saw when you entered was a pile of shoes. The TV might be on, sometimes there'd be impromptu dance parties. And once people moved into the office, people moved their bodies differently, more fluidly. The boundaries between people felt less rigid, people snuggled or played with one another's hair, rested their heads on one another's laps or shoulders, and joked or argued or played games. If you came in the late morning or the early afternoon, the air in the office filled with the fragrance of tea. Sometimes there would be snacks. And then nearing 6 o'clock, people would start getting ready to leave and crowd around the mirror to put on more makeup and go out to pick up clients. So the CBOs I studied kind of varied in how their office spaces were organized. Some had posters on the walls that marked the hotspots nearby to organize outreach work. Most of them had a television somewhere, and you'd see kind of boxes of these condoms all over the office. And some actually had spaces for religious rituals too. So Hindu idols for small pujas. In some people were kind of focusing on paperwork, and then in other places you'd see kind of people weren't really doing anything related to HIV prevention. So these were also spaces sometimes where people would hold baby showers or celebrate their daughter's first period, or kind of mark important events in their lives, birthdays. And so these were spaces where the boundaries of respectability were being learned and also kind of reimagined within this space. So in some places, people use the office also to conduct sex work indoors, away from the threat of police harassment on the street, or even just the kind of danger of someone recognizing you from your village who could tell your family where they saw you. So from this kind of inside, safe, private location, sex workers could negotiate with clients over the phone, they could share clients, laugh over unexpected requests, compare notes about rates and services. And also, this is important, being in this space also made it easier to refuse a client than it might be if somebody was on the street. So an office meant shared space also to confer over things like clothing, makeup, jewelry. People sometimes bought clothes they bought to discuss prices and quality and compare notes about those things. The office also offered a space to learn new modes of behavior. So here I'm going to draw from an interview with someone I call Pallavi. And Pallavi describes how she learned to manage her voice after she started working in HIV prevention. So she says, I got courage from attending the meetings here. I learned how to talk to different kinds of people and the way to approach different kinds of people in different situations. We are rural people, and earlier I would speak crudely, but in Bangalore, one should talk neatly, prettily, and with discipline. The words that come out of my mouth should not hurt anybody. I have been shouted at a lot in this office. They used to say that I hadn't learned anything even after so many years and that I talk strangely. Now I have become perfect. I can go to any person and talk to him without fear. They praise me now. So here you see Pallavi's account kind of capturing this balance of discipline and boldness, both being more respectable and being more open about her sexuality, learning how to talk to anyone without fear. She learned this kind of discipline to navigate public space and the right forms of behavior to blend in, but also an ability to speak up when she needed. So this account kind of hints at what I've referred to as a kind of respectable sexuality, something we also see in Preeti's account of dressing in a more demure, conventionally feminine way after she started working in the office. And so interestingly, Pallavi's a cisgender woman, Preeti's a transgender woman, but they were both kind of invested in this more conventionally feminine, demure presentation after working in the office, kind of middle class and caste inflected femininity. But the office could also be a place where people debated what it meant to be respectable and to kind of embody femininity in the right way. So the last kind of piece I'll read from my fieldwork is a piece of my field notes, which is an encounter between Akshay, a working class Koti, and Shobana, who was a transgender woman who was a law student at the time. And this encounter to me kind of crystallized some of these tensions about what it meant to be respectably feminine in the context of the office. So Shobana usually wore a t-shirt and jeans, and she usually spoke in English. And Akshay always dressed in a plain pant and shirt and identified strongly as working class and usually spoke in Kannada. So one afternoon, Shobha and I sat drinking tea and talking, and Akshay joined us. So I'm going to just move to reading an excerpt from my field notes. Akshay looks at Shobana. He says, I always tell her, if you could only wear some nice earrings and a bindi, you would look so nice. As an aside, this was provoked because I was wearing some earrings that Akshay liked. So Shobana is wearing jeans and a t-shirt, no jewelry, no makeup, and her hair is loose. She says, this is my choice. I also don't wear those things, I say. At least you're wearing a bindi and earrings and a nose ring, Akshay says. And I hope you don't mind my saying, but you would look even better if you wore bangles and toe rings. It's how a Bharatiya Nari, an Indian woman, should look. It looks nice. If you're always saying you're female, you should dress like it. There are lots of ways to be a Bharatiya Nari, I say. Shobana agrees with me. This is also a way of being Indian, she says. But why do you have to dress like this, Akshay insists, now appealing to both of us. Don't feel bad, says Shobana after he leaves in a bit of a huff. He's just joking, I say. Shobana agrees, but adds, he's a little joking and he's a little serious. He comes back a little while later. You're always talking in English or Tamil, he complains to Shobana. You're so haughty, he adds. Then he switches to English. You bastard. He says that in English too. So I think this passage, it's a kind of everyday interaction and argument, but I think it kind of crystallizes how Shobana's idea of kind of an educated, middle-class, modern femininity come into conflict with Akshay's more traditional image of working-class Indian women with toe rings and bangles. And I know from conversations that this was kind of part of a larger concern for Akshay. He was very critical of kind of elite English-speaking gay activists who he'd come into contact with in kind of activist spaces. So for him, Shobana's sexuality wasn't respectable or legible as feminine, and it was kind of inauthentic. But for her, it was crucial to her social mobility. So in this encounter, you can kind of see this debate playing out over what it meant to be a respectably feminine in the Indian context, and really talking about kind of Indian femininity in particular. So the drop-in center, which is kind of a place where condoms are distributed and public health information is disseminated, also functioned as a shared space for these kinds of conflicts and became a venue in which embodiments of respectable sexuality could be practiced, but also contested in these kinds of ways. So what I've ultimately shared with you is an ethnographic approach to a massive global disease response effort that centers the experiences of those who were thought to embody the risk to the nation that AIDS represented. This kind of ethnographic approach can offer us some new directions, I think, in thinking about the relationship between global processes and everyday life. So in contrast to typical critiques of global governance institutions and public health, and particularly of the AIDS industry, and there's a lot of writing on this globally, I hope that this ethnographic approach I've offered envisions state programs as a more complex terrain of contestation where people have room to strategize. So you can see how it allows us to sometimes undercut the power of global institutions over people's lives. In this version of the story, global institutions do have the power to set the narrative and to define what a crisis is or isn't, and to define the terms of engagement, but they also must contend with people protesting and engaging with these ideas of risk, and sometimes kind of actively overturning the logics of global institutions' HIV interventions. These marginalized groups develop new ways of naming sexuality, new forms of solidarity and care, and new forms of respectability that inadvertently open avenues for making demands on the state, including demands to rethink what Indian sexuality was and could be. And this is, for example, an image of a protest organized by the Karnataka Sex Workers Union in 2010. This was a protest of the state AIDS agency, the Karnataka State AIDS Prevention Society, and it was a challenge to the practices of the state AIDS prevention program. A lot of the people who formed the Karnataka Sex Workers Union actually were initially HIV prevention workers who kind of gained their kind of networks and community through HIV prevention work, and then sort of started this activist group, and eventually were kind of able to protest the state agency. And some of them were still working within the state AIDS response while they were engaged in these kinds of challenges. So before I end, I want to just briefly reflect on kind of one more dynamic that I think can kind of put this in a broader context of the logic of crisis and these kind of conditional forms of citizenship. So many of the activists I interviewed were very aware that all the funding and access to resources they had during the HIV epidemic was temporary, even though these groups faced exclusion and violence on an everyday basis. So here, one of my interviewees points out the conditionality of the AIDS response. He says, the minute you bring HIV down to zero, you'll not be funded, no one will care about you, and you'll be back to being the pariah of the society. If a situation comes up, they drop these women like hot potatoes. So this is kind of an NGO director's response. And he says, there'll be no Avahan, no Gates Foundation, no government willing to look at you after AIDS is over. And I kind of wanted to reference also an account from one of my interviewees who was a sex worker about this same kind of dynamic. So Lata was a sex worker activist. She had started off as an HIV prevention worker. While I was doing field work, she decided to leave activism, and she opened a Bangalore shop. So I visited her in her Bangalore shop kind of a couple of years after I finished my field work, and then again a couple of years later, actually she'd turned it into a flower shop by that point. So except for the fact that this shop is kind of frequented by women who do sex work in the bus stand, you wouldn't know from a casual conversation that this is somebody who had been in Delhi and Kolkata protesting the criminalization of sex work, that she had been part of all of these kind of national consultations about sex work policy and HIV prevention. She says, what feels unjust in what they did is that they brought us all out, but then left us. They came and did something and left. We still have to be here. So the HIV epidemic temporarily placed her at the center of an impending public health crisis, but now Lata lives in the aftermath of the crisis. The donors have gone home, but she's still here. So just to conclude, the AIDS response around the world has brought into contact some of these powerful institutions and people in the world with some of these most marginalized people, right? So from Bill Gates to Lata in her Bengal stall. As a woman, sex worker, poor, and Dalit, Lata has faced brutal circumstances in her life. And the crisis of the epidemic actually forced global institutions and the state to pay attention to those everyday violences. But after the crisis was over, they could go back to being marginalized and criminalized. So I think this is why it's especially important to make sense of kind of the afterlives of the AIDS response and the way it reshaped everyday life for sex workers, sexual minorities, and transgender people in India. Because ultimately, what the AIDS response left behind was really these small transformations and how Lata imagined herself and how she connected with other people, and how she thought of herself as worthy of dignity and not just a source of risk. So I'll stop here, and I am looking forward to questions and thoughts.
Thank you so much, Gowri. Okay, I can kick us off with one question, and then I will get questions from the audience. And please feel free to type in the chat box as well if you are unable to personally say it out loud. So, so my work is in anti-trafficking, and I think there's a lot of crossover. And the anti-trafficking framework gained traction several years after the AIDS crisis, I think. And in the context of India, it's probably not backed by as many millions of dollars as AIDS prevention was, but still, had a considerable amount of U.S. funding, right? And this approach entrenches a fairly carceral approach and an end demand approach to sex work. So I was wondering about two things. One, how did these different mobilizations and interactions, so the AIDS response and anti-trafficking, play out on the ground and in the civil society space? And second is, have sex workers been able to draw on the whatever credibility or capital they have from being incorporated in the AIDS response to challenge anti-trafficking framework? So how is this engaged? A bit about the politics of memory, I guess. How is this engagement remembered? Do people actually recognize the role that was played by sex workers here, and has that given them any leverage?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sharmila. Thank you for asking it. And I think it's actually really important. And I think this is where, and I think in this talk, I kind of tried to present the politics of sex work and the politics of sexuality and some of the transgender bills that have been put forward recently within the same frame. But this is kind of where sex work in particular is different, and the trajectory of HIV for sex worker organizations is different. So yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that, for even at the beginning of the HIV response in India, and anti-trafficking organizations sort of did exist. As you said, they're kind of more, the juggernaut is kind of increasingly powerful. But during the kind of period of AIDS organizing among sex workers, AIDS kind of became like a counterweight to the anti-trafficking establishment. And this was both at the national level and at the local level. So at the national level, for example, in 2006, there was this amendment to the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act, which was brought forward by the Ministry of Women and Child Development. And it was the result of a lot of lobbying from anti-trafficking organizations. And the challenge to it came from sex worker organizations were really at the time kind of involved in the HIV response. So a lot of the funding for their organizing came from HIV prevention and was kind of used to this end. And even the National AIDS Control Organization, the state agency, actually kind of submitted an affidavit in court to oppose the amendment. So it was like two agencies of the state in court opposing each other with pressure from different constituencies of people involved in sex work policy. And at that time, the HIV prevention effort and NACO's pressure was effective enough that amendment was derailed. What's been interesting is that more recently, that's shifted, right? So there have been new, as you probably know, anti-trafficking bills brought forward in India that have been much more successful. And, I've talked to people on the ground who've said, now anti-trafficking organizations are winning because there isn't this counterweight. On the ground, because I think your other question is about kind of how does this play out in terms of civil society, a couple of things. So depending on the place, right? So in Kolkata, I did interview one kind of anti-trafficking organization leader. And I remember her saying, she actually died later on after I interviewed her. She said, that we can't do anything in the red light districts because DMSC is so powerful. So she actually felt very crowded out by the narrative. And you can even see people like Gloria and Steinem have written about this. They kind of hate the AIDS prevention effort in India because they say it's empowered all of these brothel madams. They have a very specific kind of narrative of it. In Bangalore, where I was, I actually went to some anti-trafficking events with sex worker activists who I was working with. And, it really seemed like sex workers organizations had largely kind of been able to overshadow some of the anti-trafficking organizations in the Bangalore political scene. So they were more vocal and they kind of would speak out on things. But, this is kind of like how policing works. There's kind of like a wave of crackdowns kind of during a moral panic, and then it kind of recedes again. So depending on what's going on, there's periods of cleanup and kind of anti-trafficking raids, and then periods when, but I think it was like a little more balanced battle in Bangalore. I've talked to people who work in other regions who have said that the shift has been more dramatic. So Kimberly Walters, who studies both HIV organizations and anti-trafficking organizations, she has a really interesting paper about this organization that was a sex worker rights organization that did HIV prevention work, and later on, after like the mid 2010s, became an anti-trafficking group because that was where the funding went, and so they just completely shifted their ideology because of that. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think probably the larger takeaway is that without the counterweight of HIV, we do see anti-trafficking institutions and discourses winning out and kind of having a powerful effect on state policy. But there are some activist groups, all the activist groups who are responding to the anti-trafficking bill, for example, are groups that came out of this like legacy of HIV prevention and sex worker rights that formed kind of with the catalyst of HIV behind them. So the one response continues to be from this arena. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Gowri. That is quite fascinating, actually. Okay, so please feel free to use the raise your hand function, or send me a private message for anyone else who has questions. Oh, Hasrit.
Yes. Hi. I don't know how to raise my hand actually here.
It's fine. It works.
It works. Thank you so much, Gowri. I really enjoyed your talk. And I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about did you see any major difference in the different field sites? And also, how were you welcomed or not welcomed? Maybe as a Indian, I assume, I don't know from your name. Yourself, and in that context, but maybe also coming from a university abroad. Did you have any, did you come to represent those funding agencies that they were working with in some sense? Was there kind of negotiation you had to do, or yeah, maybe if you could talk, and you did quite a lot of field work actually, and you've been back several times. So I wonder if you could also tell us about that kind of going back, and how that meant for each time you were going back. Was it the same, or did you just pick up where you left? Yeah, just some questions about that element of it. Thank you very much.
Hasrat, that's a great set of questions. And I could probably talk for another hour to answer them, but I'll try to be efficient. So yeah, I mean, differences in field sites. Yeah, I try to write about this a little bit in the book, and actually I have an article in Social Problems that kind of talks a little bit more about variations among different organizations and the way that they position themselves within kind of local associational fields and how they articulate sex work differently. So yeah, I mean, I think regional politics matters quite a bit. So for example, between Kolkata and Bangalore, I saw a big difference in terms of organizational history, but also, the political culture. This is something that, my graduate school supervisor and Nazanin's as well wrote about in her book about the Indian women's movement, right? Kolkata, as a communist ruled state, at least for until partway through the period I'm talking about in the book, there is a political culture of kind of leftist workers activism, and sex workers there really kind of had that political culture to draw on, even though the Communist Party wasn't always that supportive. They still had to do a lot of kind of work to win over party members. There was this kind of political culture, which was very different from Bangalore, where it's a very NGOized kind of feminist landscape. And so the discourses are different. The left is kind of smaller. So there were some organizations in Bangalore that were more kind of like entrepreneurial in their orientation, had more of kind of corporate ties, and others that had a more kind of link to leftist organizations. And that plays out in the way they talk about sex work and kind of the alliances that they build. In Nairobi, it was also a different kind of situation, because there, the state response wasn't particularly interested in working with sex worker organizations at first, even though there was a lot of research on sex workers that was done in Nairobi in particular. The state response was not particularly interested in what are now called key populations until later on. So there were all these groups that had been working but with kind of global funding, and global funding means a very different kind of political orientation, I think, because it's a lot of these organizations were working with multiple donors, kind of trying to meet multiple different donor demands, and so they weren't necessarily oriented toward advocacy with the state in the same way until later on. So during the time of my fieldwork, the Kenyan National AIDS Control Council was starting to want to incorporate key populations into its policy. So that was a shift that was taking place. So organizations felt a little bit more kind of like cut off from advocacy opportunities. So that was again a different articulation there. So yeah, there's a lot more I could say about differences in field sites, but these are kind of some of the big differences. In terms of field work, yeah, so I think within my Bangalore field work, I was initially perceived as kind of part of, depending on the organization, but part of a donor organization, or sometimes part like a student. So I kind of more at that time was able to identify myself as a student, because there were lots of students who would come and do internships or like short placements, like social work students who would come through. And sometimes, you know, especially one of the organizations did a lot of trainings with students to kind of talk about like sexuality. And so yeah, I kind of like was seen within that light. And it took a lot of work to kind of move beyond that, I think. And my approach to fieldwork is, you know, that it's not that I'm trying to kind of pretend to be anything that I'm not. So I'm not going to disavow the privilege of being from a US institution, or being kind of a diasporic person who didn't actually grow up in Bangalore but has family ties there. So I was always very open about those things when people asked about them. But yeah, it definitely took kind of work and relationship building. I did have the benefit in Bangalore of kind of language skills, and, you know, a family who lived there, and lots of kind of just local, maybe cultural familiarity with the city that I think helped me to build. And, you know, even things like knowing music and being able to like dance with people at the like drop-in center. I mean, those things actually helped a lot. In years later, when I went back, people would say things to me like that. They would say like, you know, I remember that you danced with us all like on the first day you came, and like that was a big deal, you know. So those kinds of things actually mattered, and I think is one of the ways, you know, that we draw on our subjectivity in doing in field work. And, you know, for me, it was definitely clear. And I think my fieldwork period in Kenya was a lot shorter and was kind of more focused in its goals, but I didn't have that same kind of relationship to the place when I was doing work in Nairobi and Mombasa. So, but, you know, the way that my positionality played out there was that it was very easy to have conversations about the relationship between India and Kenya with people in Kenya when people see me as Indian. So, you know, it was easy to open up those conversations. You know, people were interested in talking about that, especially because they were involved in this kind of effort to, you know, think about Indian HIV prevention efforts within Kenya. So, so that, you know, my positionality worked in a different way there. But yeah, and I think going back, so I haven't actually gone back to Kenya since I did the field work, but I've been in touch with people over Facebook and stuff. But in India, I went back several times and also kind of became more involved in other research projects and collaborations with some groups, not all. So, so I started to kind of think about my role in the academy as more about kind of what resources could I direct to people who I worked with, or how could I connect them with, you know, resources, or how could I like do research that might actually help them engage their work differently. So those kinds of things, friendships or collaborations kind of came out. So I think my relationship with organizations in Bangalore have shifted since the end of my field work to be more like, yeah, those kind of more collaborative relationships. And I do think, you know, for people who are doing fieldwork, going back actually does make a huge difference. And, you know, it does sometimes feel like you're picking up where you left off, right? Because I think it kind of, over time, I started to realize like I would show up after a year and people like didn't seem to think it was that big of a deal that I was there. And I felt like that was a success, you know, that I was like familiar enough of a presence that, and I think actually leaving and coming back can be a way to cement that trust, maybe. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions? Nazanin.
Thank you very much, Gowri. Of course, I've been reading your stuff, not just the book, but also the articles. And I have to say here that Gowri also has a very beautiful writing style, and, you know, all sorts of writings that you've done, all the blog posts and everything. I have two questions, mostly just to give you the space to talk more about this multi-layer work that you've done. So one question, just building up on Hazrat and your response. Since I also did work, where you did work was not your hometown, but I did work in what I consider still after all these years, 20 years, my hometown. There were moments, because you talked about the social cultural capital of kind of being from a place or being familiar with the people or with culture, with cultural codes. When I was doing field work, there were moments where I actually felt that while I was at home, but I was not at home, I did not feel at home. And there were moments that I felt that actually my familiarity or my perceived familiarity with certain codes made me, basically because of that, I could not see certain things, or I would say things that I would realize that it was not a shared perception. So I invested a lot, or I thought a lot about this kind of, I know all the codes, I know all the dynamics, I'm able to kind of translate and what people say or read what people are telling me, but that was not the case in many occasions. So I wanted to see if that also happened to you, and if there were moments where you had to kind of undo this familiarity or what you thought you knew about home. The other thing just is more about content, and I know these are again broad questions, but I also see some of our students here. So I also wanted to hear a lot about the meso level of your work. I think we got a very good sense about what happens on the everyday level in the office and elsewhere, but I wanted to hear more about what was Bill Gates doing there. I think we heard your argument about the Indian state and why they presented the case and the crisis the way they did. But I'm wondering about these kind of corporations and, you know, foundations that went in India and invested.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, these are really great questions, and I've learned so much from your writing, Nazanin, about your fieldwork and fieldwork process. So so it's nice to be able to engage around this. Yeah, so I think the question about home and unlearning cultural codes is really it's really generative, because I think for me, grew up in the US and had this very kind of like nostalgic diasporic relationship with Bangalore, because I went there in the summers and kind of went there when I was growing up. And then I had spent a little bit, I lived there, you know, for brief periods, like for a year or so, kind of at different points. And so, you know, I also had a pretty sheltered view, or I guess really what, you know, I came to understand as a very caste and class specific view of the city because of my my caste and class background. And so for me, actually, one of the things that fieldwork really helped me with is to learn a completely different kind of version of the city than what I had been able to engage before that point. And that meant, yeah, I mean, it meant everything from learning completely new vocabularies, because I was learning how to talk about, you know, sex and sexuality. And, you know, when I started fieldwork, I had, you know, and I speak Kannada because I learned it at home, but I didn't know a lot of the terminology around and sexual categories and things like that. So learning vocabulary was part of it, but then also like learning how people navigate the city differently than how I had, you know, grown up navigating things. So actually, like related to your work, Nazneen, I recently wrote this like short chapter about taking the bus with my informants, because when I was growing up and when I was in India, like everybody said that the bus was like a place where sexual harassment happens, and like a good middle class, upper caste girl does not go on the bus. But during fieldwork, I went on the bus all the time. And so I actually sort of like learned what this form of the public is, like these kind of gendered contestations that happen on the bus. And, you know, a lot of the sex workers I talked to actually also had kind of come into contact with sex work and solicited at bus stands, or like had first had met clients at bus stands and stuff. So so yeah, so it was kind of me learning a different urban geography, I think, during this fieldwork process. And it definitely sort of changed me and changed my relationship to the city. Yeah, the second question about the meso level, I think, is also really great. I mean, this, of course, is the part that I sort of skipped over in my talk, so I could give you the kind of macro and the micro pictures of my book. So yeah, I mean, in the book, I kind of focus on the meso level as sort of how the state managed the contradictions of the global field and sort of pressure to manage the AIDS crisis in the context of, you know, limited state capacity, but also kind of the existing nature of the Indian bureaucracy, and also the sexual moralities of the Indian bureaucracy. So, you know, you have on the one hand, and in the early years, it wasn't the Gates Foundation so much as actually like DFID and the World Bank, who were main funders, and they were, you know, they were bringing in funding, and the state was kind of trying to respond to HIV, knew that they had to find, you know, sex workers, particularly the focus was on sex workers in this time, but didn't know how to do it, and sex work is, you know, criminalized. So they're kind of in this contradictory situation. And so what I try to chart in the book is how state agencies over time kind of started to, you know, initially there was this kind of, what I described here was like the repressive period, but eventually there's this kind of incorporation, so increasing reliance on community organizations to do this work that the state couldn't kind of officially do or formally do. So the state kind of takes on these functions. And also this is a way of outsourcing some of the violence associated with doing this work, because you know, people who were doing HIV prevention work were getting beaten up by the police, right, for having condoms and things like that. And so, you know, having community-based organizations do this work instead of, you know, agents of the state was actually a way of like displacing some of this, you know, this violence and this encounter with dominant sexual moralities. So this was, this was a process that took place over time, but it was this kind of process of incorporation that I try to chart in the book. And then these organizations also then became part of more global connections because they had access to funders. The Gates Foundation actually came in relatively late to this process. So by the time they came in, a lot of these dynamics were already in place. And so when they came in, there was a lot of media attention on the Gates Foundation and Bill Gates' kind of attention to this. And actually, like the Gates Foundation wasn't that it was relatively new at this point in sort of doing global health work. Now, of course, their influence on global health is kind of unimaginably powerful. But at this time, this was kind of more of like an experimental phase, I think. And I learned some of this from reading, accounts by, people from the Gates Foundation who've written about it. So it was a period where they came in, they didn't really know what they were doing. They were kind of trying to learn from the existing response. And they had to confront kind of these sexual politics that I think for Bill Gates were actually not his main interest. And so after that, they've moved on to doing very different types of work since that time. But they really built on the kind of response that was already in place. And so one of the critiques that came from the state and from state officials and from NGOs and CBOs and others I talked to was that, the Gates Foundation is taking credit for something that was really like not their innovation at all. They kind of came in and brought funding to a program that was already well in place. And some organizations also said like they were already so established by the point the Gates Foundation came that the Gates Foundation wasn't really able to influence them very much. Like they were already doing their work. And so I think in that way, this whole encounter is a really interesting lesson because, as we see with COVID, there's this kind of, huge influence of philanthrocapitalism on global health, right? And this kind of, like the privatization of global governance. The Gates Foundation also like major funder to the WHO and influences vaccine policy. And so I think, this moment is actually, in this case, these organizations were actually sort of able to like strategize because they knew they were that the Gates Foundation and the state needed them and they could leverage that. But, at the same time, they had to like work within the constraints they were given. So, that was things like, using the same funding for HIV prevention, but then using it to hold meetings that could also double as like organizing meetings and using like office infrastructure to bring new members into activist groups and things like that. So all of these things kind of came out of the HIV prevention response by activists who are really savvy about leveraging the opportunity. So I hope that gets at your question.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have one question on the chat, but before that, I want to just do a last round. All right. I mean, no one, I do have a follow-up, so I'm just going to tack that on. So my follow-up to what Nazanin and Astrid asked actually is, given that I'm assuming some of the interviews were not conducted in English, right? And you've already kind of mentioned that you had to, you encountered new vocabularies and had to how did you deal with translation in your work, given that you write in English? I'm just very curious about, I mean, there's going to be no perfect equivalence, right? But what was your methodological journey then on that front? Like, how did you deal with these concepts that don't really travel well? Is one. And the second one, I'm going to read out the question in the chat, and I guess you can just answer it together. Which is, so this question basically references a case in South Africa where mining companies, in order to reduce the loss of lives suffered under the HIV pandemic, actually provided free HIV prevention or cure, but in fact was really for very instrumental purpose. So the question is, what are your opinions on corporations' involvement in issues such as this? Does it actually mitigate suffering? Or is there such a thing as enlightened self-interest in this context? And also comparatively to international organizations, I suppose. I'm interested to hear about your opinion regarding how the involvement of corporations can impact the stigmatization of people such as homosexuals compared to direct interventions by international orgs. I think we can end on those two questions.
Thank you for those questions. So yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this translation question because recently I've been working on an autobiography of an activist I met during my field work who where she actually told me her story in a mix of Kannada and English, and sort of like I'm learning more about the kind of practice of translation by working with her on that, and thinking about it maybe more consciously than I did when I was doing the field work, actually. So yeah, when I did my field work, I did the interviews in Kannada, and I did interviews with government officials. Sometimes they were often in English, or sometimes a mix of Kannada and English. And so, yeah, so translation was a part of the process. And what I did was actually, I transcribed most of a good amount of my interviews, good number of my interviews myself. So I transcribed them directly into English, and then I would just like put in phrases in Kannada that were like hard to translate and kind of mark them as later on I'm going to come back to them and figure out how I want to explain this in English. And then I also had a strategy of like I would put things in italics if the person said the word in English originally, because sometimes it's actually important to pay attention to what English words enter into Kannada, right? And especially when it comes to things like describing sexual identity. So that was kind of my practice. And then, so with some of my interviews, I did have other people transcribe them, and they also, transcribe directly into English. But then I was contending with like different translations that might not be the way I would translate something. And so, then I would often go back to the original. But I think, in this case, translation is hugely important because, words around things like agency and choice are often really kind of shaped by the language, the possibilities of the language, and within these spaces that are interacting with these global discourses and state discourses all the time. There are these words that are in English that have actually come to take on a completely different meaning. So words like crisis, I talk about the word crisis in the book, or word like even training, or like meeting, all these words that are like brought into Kannada that have become almost like Kannada words, but they're like, they're used in a particular way that I wanted to pay attention to how they were being used. So I did my best to do that, but it was a complicated and interesting process, and I think one that I got better at it over time as I worked through the process. I also kind of learned, one of the things that I learned was I used to be very like direct about my translations. Like I would try to just translate every word and be completely faithful to what was said. But I realized that sometimes that undercut the kind of eloquence of the person speaking. And so what I sort of tried to learn to do was to rewrite or not rewrite, but kind of edit in a way where I could capture what was said, but try to, capture also the kind of like eloquence of what was said in the original language. So that was something I kind of learned to do over time that I was initially very nervous about doing. So the last question, and I'll kind of read this as an interest in like thinking about the role of corporate funding and, HIV in particular as something that has attracted funding from some very kind of ideologically varied actors, and particular corporate funding, as India's case shows. So kind of, what's the takeaway from this? I mean, I think, interestingly, when I went into my fieldwork, I think I had this very kind of like critical perspective on the role of corporate funders and one of the things that surprised me was that, for the people I was engaging with, they were very kind of practical and strategic about how they used corporate resources. So, some of them did have, depending on the ideology of the organization, of course, some had like very close ties to corporate social responsibility efforts, and some came from leftist backgrounds and they were like anti-globalization and anti-corporate, and, both of them were like participating in corporate funded AIDS programming. And so, a lot of times they were navigating it in a pragmatic way, right? So, how do we use these funds? What do we use them for? How do we get it to work toward what we want, right? And so I think actually this is one of the things, like, I don't know, if there's like a strategic lesson from my fieldwork, I think this would be one of them, kind of for places outside of this context, is like being able to leverage resources for a variety of ends. But I think we also could on a more macro scale, we could see how the way that AIDS was dealt with in India was the logics it followed were not invested in, for example, really rebuilding the Indian public health system, right? Or really rethinking sexual policy, or the inclusion of sex workers kind of in society at large, right? So these weren't questions that, corporate interventions are interested in, right? Because, and this is like a particular to the Gates Foundation, but also could probably be said of a lot of global donors. There's an interest in kind of magic bullets and like responses that can then be evaluated quickly and then show results, right? So the Gates Foundation like talks about how many lives have been saved by their intervention, but not really like how, what happened to the public system, health system after they left. And so they basically built this like parallel structure to deal with AIDS that was outside of the normal workings of the public health system. And so after the crisis was over, like that whole infrastructure, all of these people who had been trained to do outreach, that was all kind of now just left on its own, right? And so I think these are some of the lasting effects. And yeah, I think now, and I talk a little bit about this toward the end of my book, kind of, we can just see the kind of growth of, the growth and influence of these corporate logics and kind of corporate philanthropy in global health in ways that seem much more kind of insidious now than in the story I tell, in which I think some of these groups were still able to leverage and pragmatically take advantage of resources in a way that now I don't know, maybe it looks very different now than it did then.
Okay. I think we've hit 7 actually. So thank you so much, Gowri. This was amazing. Thanks to everyone else for the engaging questions as well. So I assume we will put up the recording soon. So thanks everyone. Have a good evening, afternoon, morning, wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to meet you all.
I'm staying.
Okay.
Yeah.
You all.
Yeah. Bye. No, I'm just waiting to say bye. A good